In the city of Aurellia, a jewel of urban planning nestled between towering mountains and deep blue lakes, life was a performance of elegance and exclusivity. Its streets, always impeccably clean, its gardens, works of landscape art, and its architecture, a harmonious dance between the classical and the modern, created an atmosphere of almost unreal perfection. Aurellia was not just a city. It was a closed ecosystem, a fortress of wealth where traditional families and the new titans of technology coexisted in a complex web of alliances and appearances. The stunning beauty of the place, however, hid a cold and rarefied air. It was a world where success was the only measure of worth, where an invitation to the right event was a social currency more valuable than money itself, and where any sign of imperfection or vulnerability was treated with the most polite and cruel of weapons, silence and elegant indifference. In stark contrast to Aurelia's meticulous brilliance, across the train tracks that were stubbornly late stretched Verro Plains, the peripheral suburb that served as the invisible engine of the elite city. Its houses were small, with facades that had already lost the battle against time, and gardens that were born of stubbornness and creativity. Public services failed with dismal regularity, and the promises of social advancement were distant legends told by the elders. However, what Verro Plains lacked in infrastructure and glamour, it overflowed in human warmth. A network of solidarity, forged in daily hardships, united the neighbors. There were exchanges of favors, shared plates of food, and a sense of community that transformed scarcity into ingenuity. It was in this universe of harsh realities and strong ties that Lyra Nellis, a young woman of 27, lived her existence, a daily witness to the invisible but insurmountable border that separated her world from Aurelia's. Lyra Nellis's life was a tapestry woven from the threads of exhaustion, responsibility, and a silent rage against the invisibility to which she had been condemned. During the day, her nimble fingers danced over the keys of the cash register at a local grocery store, the constant beeping of the clock ticking as she worked for a salary that barely covered her expenses. At the end of the day, when her body needed rest, her soul took her to a small room in the back of the neighborhood church, where she gave free tutoring to the children of the community. She saw in those curious little eyes a reflection of herself, a thirst for knowledge that the system insisted on ignoring, and she felt an almost fierce duty to offer them the tools that had been denied to her. Lyra was intelligent, practical, and sometimes bitter, a natural consequence of her daily battle against a world that seemed to have forgotten her existence. The epicenter of Lyra's universe, the driving force behind her tireless struggle, and the source of her deepest anguish, was her older sister, Kael. At 32, Kael was chained to an increasing fragility, a prisoner of advanced kidney failure that subjected her to the torture of dialysis 3 times a week. Each session was a reminder of the precariousness of her life and the desperate slowness of the waiting list for a transplant in the public health system. Guilt was a shadow that followed Lyra day and night. Guilt for not having a better job to pay for private treatment. Guilt for not being able to do more. Guilt for seeing Kael's vitality fading away with each passing day. The love she felt for her sister was the fuel for her resilience, but also the weight that prevented her from dreaming of a future for herself. Despite the physical weakness that consumed her, Kael possessed a lucidity and spiritual strength that served as a counterpoint to Lyra's bitter pragmatism. From the bed where she spent most of her days, she watched her sister sink into exhaustion and pent-up rage, and tried, with her soft but firm voice, to be her moral compass. "You are not the savior of the world, Lyra," she would say during the long, sleepless nights. "You need to breathe. You need to live. Don't lose yourself while trying to find me." Kael's words were both a balm and a torture for Lyra, who felt selfish for even considering her own needs. For her, there was no time for lightness or for the fairy tales she had long since stopped believing in. Her reality was that of hospital corridors, the smells of antiseptic, and the silent countdown that her sister's body seemed to face. Across Aurellia, on the top floor of the towering Morley Tower, a skyscraper that was the symbol of his power, Kael Morley lived in his own version of a prison. At 34, the CEO of Morley Tech, a global cyber infrastructure giant, he was a specter to the outside world. He had inherited the empire at 28, after the tragic death of his father, a brilliant but emotionally tyrannical man who had taught him that. Vulnerability was the gateway to ruin. Kael had learned his lesson with brutal efficiency, building around himself a wall of impenetrable professionalism and icy detachment. The press called him the robot billionaire, a man who seemed immune to the foibles of affection and worldly distractions, driven only by logic and ambition. The only chink in Kael Morley's armor, the only point of vulnerability in his emotional fortitude, was his 5-year-old son, Ezren. 3 years earlier, life had violently ripped away his wife, Lyra, a vibrant and radiant artist, in a car accident he refused to talk about. Grief had closed him off, rather than opened him up, and all the love and concern he couldn't process had been channeled almost obsessively toward little Ezren. The boy, a quiet child with a vivid imagination and severe asthma that required constant care, became the center of Kael's universe. But this love manifested itself as a suffocating security protocol, a constant surveillance that robbed the child of the spontaneity and lightness of childhood. Kael feared losing his son so much that he ended up imprisoning him in a gilded, overprotective cage. Ezren Morley, on the other hand, found refuge in his own world of silence and color. The boy drew compulsively, as if colored pencils were the only language capable of expressing the complexity of his feelings. And on his sheets of paper, a face repeated itself with a constancy that intrigued and worried Kael and his tutors. The face of a young woman, with a kind look and dark hair, whom he drew in different scenarios, sometimes smiling, sometimes with a serious expression. Kael had tried a few times to ask his son who that woman was, but Ezren would shut down, silence being his only response. What Kael had no idea was that that face belonged to the clearest and most crucial memory of Ezren's short life, the face of the woman who had saved his life during a terrible asthma attack 2 years earlier. The event had been etched into Ezren's mind with lightning clarity. He had been in a park with his then nanny when the air seemed to leave his lungs. The feeling of drowning, the panic in the nanny's eyes as she didn't know how to use the emergency pump, the fear of the approaching darkness, and then the appearance of that woman. She wasn't wearing a doctor's uniform, nor did she look wealthy. She was just a young woman passing by. But she acted with a calm and firmness that dispelled the panic. She calmed him with her voice, administered the medicine with precision, and stayed by his side, whispering comforting words until his breathing returned to normal and help arrived. He never learned her name. She had disappeared into the crowd, but her face, her voice, the sense of security she had given him, became a secret amulet in his childhood memory. It was in this landscape of parallel universes, secret pains, and unshared memories that an elegant and unexpected piece of paper appeared in Lyra Nellis's life. Her neighbor in Verro Plains, an octogenarian named Mrs. Gable, for whom Lyra often did small kindnesses like going to the grocery store, had worked for decades as a kitchen maid for one of the most traditional families in Aurellia. As a parting gift upon her retirement, she had received an invitation to the most exclusive event in town, the annual Morley Foundation benefit ball. With her legs already tired and no longer interested in that world of appearances, Mrs. Gable had an idea. "You take it, my dear," she had said to Lyra, extending the invitation. "You work so hard, you deserve a princess's night. And who knows what fate has in store for you. Maybe you'll find someone who will listen to your story about Nael. Mrs. Gable's suggestion seemed at first like a far-fetched fantasy to Lyra. Her, at the Morley's ball, with her plain clothes, her work-hardened hands, her lack of social graces to navigate that aquarium of elegant sharks. It would be a recipe for humiliation. She felt like a Cinderella, without a fairy godmother, without a carriage, without the slightest chance of fitting in. Her first reaction was to politely decline, thank her for the gesture, but dismiss the idea as madness. She would spend the evening taking care of Nael as she always did. That was her place, her reality. The world of galas and millionaire philanthropists was not for her. It belonged to another dimension, a dimension she only heard about from the magazines she saw, in the checkout line at the grocery store. But Mrs. Gable's words, maybe you can find someone who will listen to your story about Nael, stuck in her mind like a hook. Hope, that treacherous, resilient emotion she had worked so hard to keep under control, began to bubble. What if it was a chance? One in a million, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. A chance to be in the same room as renowned doctors, hospital directors, philanthropists who might take an interest in her sister's case. Maybe she could approach someone, tell them Nael's story, hand over a small dossier she had prepared with the tests and her status on the waiting list. The idea was desperate, but desperation was Lyra's natural state these days. The fear of humiliation was immense, but the terror of losing her sister was infinitely greater. Nael, upon learning of the opportunity, became her sister's greatest supporter. From her bedside, with the glow of fever in her eyes, but also with the light of hope, she insisted that Lyra go. You have to go, Lyra. For the first time in years, destiny is giving you a different card to play. Don't waste it out of fear, she argued, her voice weak but full of conviction. Forget the humiliation, think of the possibility, and if it doesn't work out, at least you'll have a good story to tell me. Nael's words, added to the lump of hope that had formed in Lyra's throat, were decisive. She decided to go. She would face the lion's den, not for herself, but for the only person who mattered in her life. The decision was made, and with it a wave of anxiety and a strange determination took over her being. The preparation for the ball was an exercise in creativity and solidarity typical of Verro Plains. Lyra had no money for a formal dress, and the idea of renting one was out of the question. But word of her mission spread quietly through the neighborhood, and the community rallied. Mrs. Gable offered a pair of low-heeled shoes she had barely worn. A neighbor, who worked as a seamstress in a clothing store, took a bolt of dark blue velvet, a forgotten scrap from a past collection, and stayed up all night transforming an old dress model of Lyra's into something simple but surprisingly elegant. Another neighbor, who sold cosmetics through catalogs, showed up with a makeup kit and gave Lyra her first lessons. There was no luxury, but there was affection in every detail of this improvised production. On the night of the ball, when she looked at herself in the cracked mirror in her small room, Lyra almost didn't recognize herself. The dark blue dress highlighted the paleness of her skin and the intensity of her eyes. The discreet makeup hid the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream, to imagine herself as one of Aurelia's ladies, but reality soon brought her back. In her simple bag, she carried not a designer wallet, but an envelope with Nael's exams, and the desperate hope that this night could change her sister's destiny. She said goodbye to Nael with a kiss on the forehead and a wish me luck, and set off towards Aurelia's heart, feeling like a soldier marching into an uncertain and dangerous battle. Arriving at the sumptuous hotel where the ball was being held was an abrupt plunge into an ocean of opulence that left her breathless. Luxury cars with white-gloved chauffeurs glided silently up to the entrance, depositing women wrapped in silk, jewelry, and expensive perfumes. and men in impeccable tuxedos who exuded power and self-confidence. Lyra, who had arrived by bus and walked the last few blocks, immediately felt like a blur, a blemish in the perfect landscape. Every glance she received seemed to dissect her, noting her nondescript dress, her simple shoes, her aura of not belonging. The urge to turn around and run was overwhelming, but the image of Niall's pale face kept her steady. Heart pounding, she walked toward the reception, the elegant invitation in her trembling hands. At the entrance to the main hall, a line of guests waited patiently as their names were checked against a digital list on a tablet held by a receptionist with a practiced smile. When it was Lyra's turn, she handed over her invitation. The receptionist looked at the paper, then at her and back again, her expression changing subtly from a professional smile to a slight frown of suspicion. "Miss Gable?" the receptionist asked, her tone a little too loud, drawing the attention of those around her. No, the invitation is from Mrs. Gable. She couldn't make it and asked me to represent her." Lyra tried to explain, her voice lower than she would have liked. The receptionist exchanged a look with the burly security guard at her side, a look that said, "We have a problem." The bouncer approached, a wall of muscle and authority. "Ma'am, the invitations are personal and non-transferable," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "The name on the invitation does not match yours, and you are not on the confirmed guest list. I ask that you leave immediately to avoid embarrassment." The words were spoken with brutal clarity, each one a small stab at Lyra's pride. The embarrassment was inevitable. The whispers around her grew louder, the stares now openly hostile and curious. She was the intruder, the gatecrasher, the girl from Verro Plains who had dared to dream that she could frequent the same air as the elite of Aurellia. Her face burned, a deep humiliation washing over her, mixed with helpless rage. Lyra was about to obey, to turn and disappear into the night, taking with her the pieces of her shattered dignity, when the course of events was altered by a small but irresistible force. From inside the hall, coming from the direction of the evening's host, Kael Morley, a small figure slipped from her father's hand. It was Ezren. The boy, who had spent the entire evening listless and silent at Kael's side, suddenly seemed to have seen a ghost, or rather, an angel. His eyes, usually lost in their own world, fixed on Lyra with an intensity and recognition that shocked her father. And with an energy no one had known he possessed, the boy began to run toward the entrance, toward her. Ezren's run through the hall caused a small chaos. Kael, taken by surprise, tried to call him, but the boy didn't hear him. He dodged the guests with unexpected agility, his eyes fixed on Lyra as if she were a magnet. He reached the entrance, panting, his breathing starting to become difficult due to the effort and his asthma. But he ignored his own discomfort. In front of Lyra, the security guard, and the astonished guests, Ezren didn't say a word. He just opened his arms and hugged her with the strength of someone who finds a safe haven after a long and terrible storm. The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to that extraordinary scene. The reclusive son of billionaire Kael Morley, who according to the gossip could barely tolerate touch, desperately and affectionately hugging the unknown woman who had just been barred from the door. Kael Morley, who had hurriedly followed his son, stopped a few feet away from the scene, paralyzed by a mixture of panic, confusion, and an emotion he couldn't name. He saw his son's embrace, the way the little boy clung to that woman, and then he looked at her face, and the memory, like a lightning bolt, hit him. The face. It was the same face from Ezren's drawings, the woman from the park. The anonymous savior who had haunted his son's mind for 2 years. In that instant, Kael understood everything. Ezren's reaction, his fixation on the drawings, the reason why the boy had run like that. And at the same time, he realized the cruelty of the situation. The woman who had saved his son's life was being publicly humiliated at the door of her own event. A wave of protective fury, an emotion he hadn't felt so intensely since Ilara's death, took hold of Kael. Fury against the security guard for his lack of sensitivity, against the guests for their malicious looks, against the system of appearances that he himself had helped to build, and fury against himself for not having met that woman sooner, for not having thanked her, for not knowing of her existence until that moment. He needed to act, he needed to fix this, to protect not only his son, but also that woman from the veracity of that environment. And, in an impulse that defied all his logical and calculating nature, he made a drastic decision, a lie that at that moment seemed the only solution to silence the vultures and to give meaning to that surreal scene. Moving forward with firm steps, Kael placed a protective hand on Lyra's shoulder, who was still crouched, hugging Ezren, completely stunned. He looked directly at the security guard, his voice as cold as steel. "There has been a grave misunderstanding here," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "This lady is with me. It was my personal staff's fault for not updating the guest list in time." The murmurs in the audience grew louder, curiosity now mixed with awe at the intervention of the mighty Kael Morley. But he knew that was not enough. He needed something more, something definitive, something that would end any speculation and protect Lyra from further questions and humiliation. And then he uttered the sentence that would change the fate of them all. Looking around at the curious faces, then at Lyra with an intensity that made her catch her breath, Kael Morley added, his voice clear and echoing through the now silent hall. "After all, it would be rather impolite and unforgivable of me to bar my own wife from entering." The word wife dropped like a grenade into the room. A shocked silence followed, quickly replaced by a burst of camera phone flashes and a deafening hubbub. Kael Morley, Aurelia's most eligible and reclusive widower, was married, and was his secret wife, the plain-looking, unknown woman who had nearly been thrown out of the ball. The story was a scandal, a bombshell, the news of the year, and Kael, with that one audacious lie, had just thrown Lyra Nellis into the eye of the storm. Lyra felt the world spin. Wife? The word echoed in her mind, absurd, terrifying, but at the same time, for a fleeting moment, strangely protective. She looked at Kael, trying to find some sign of madness in his eyes, but saw only cold determination and a silent message that seemed to say, "Trust me, play along." Ezren, still clinging to her, smiled, oblivious to the earthquake that his father's words had caused. Led by Kael, who kept a firm hand on her back, Lyra was led into the hall through a sea of astonished looks, forced smiles, and poorly disguised whispers. The invisible girl from Verro Plains was now, for all intents and purposes, the mysterious Mrs. Morley, the most envied and talked about woman in Aurellia. The night of the ball turned into a surreal performance for Lyra. She was introduced to senators, CEOs of multinational companies, and heiresses to ancient fortunes. She answered questions about her secret marriage with monosyllabic answers or enigmatic smiles, letting Kael lead the narrative of this farce. He was brilliant in his acting, inventing a plausible story about a discreet romance, away from the spotlight, and a recent, intimate wedding to preserve privacy. Lyra felt like a spectator of her own life, an amateur actress thrust into the lead role of a play for which she didn't know the lines. The only real thing amidst that vertigo of appearances was Ezren's little hand, which didn't let go of her for a single instant, her little anchor of truth in that ocean of lies. In a private room, away from the curiosity of the guests, the inevitable conversation between Lyra and Kael took place. The tension was palpable. Lyra, now that the initial shock had worn off, felt a mixture of anger at his audacity and reluctant gratitude for his saving her from humiliation. Kael, for his part, looked exhausted, his mask of control beginning to crumble. He explained about Ezren's drawings, about the story of the rescue in the park, which he had only understood at that moment. "I panicked," he confessed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that made him surprisingly human. "It was the only thing I could think of to protect you, to protect my son's joy. I'm sorry for putting you in this situation." Lyra listened to him in silence, absorbing the complexity of that man. He was not the cold monster the press painted him to be, nor the prince charming some socialites imagined. He was a desperate father, a man haunted by pain, acting on impulses that not even he fully understood. And then he made the proposal that would make everything even more complicated. Ezren's reaction today was the greatest proof that he needs you, Kael said, his voice low, almost a plea. "I don't know what you have, what you've done, but you are the only person who has managed to break through the wall he built around himself. I ask you, Lyra, to stay at my house for a while, just a few weeks, to be close to him. I will pay whatever it takes, and maybe we can find a way to help you with your sister." The mention of Nael was the bait that Lyra could not ignore. The possibility, however remote, of using this bizarre situation to get help for her sister was too tempting. But at what cost? Moving to the Morley mansion, living under the same roof as this enigmatic man, maintaining the sham of marriage. It was a dangerous game, one that could cost her her peace of mind and what little she had left of her own identity. She thought about refusing, about returning to her simple, predictable life in Verro Plains. But the image of Ezren's embrace, the memory of the sparkle in his eyes, and the hope that she could finally save Nael spoke louder. With a broken heart, she accepted, but on her own terms. "I'll stay," Lyra said, her voice firm. "But not for your money, Mr. Morley. I'll stay for Ezren, and on the condition that you help me find a solution to my sister's case, using your foundation's influence, not as a payment, but as a partnership. And this wife farce will have a deadline. Once the dust settles, we'll find a way to part ways amicably." Kael, surprised and admired by Lyra's stance, who refused to be a mere pawn in his game, agreed to all the terms. The pact was sealed, and Lyra Nellis, the girl from the invisible list, prepared to enter the gilded cage of Aurelia's high society once and for all, not knowing whether she would emerge as hunter or prey. Lyra's move to Morley Mansion was a discreet event, but one that fundamentally altered the dynamics of the place. The first few days were filled with an almost palpable strangeness. Lyra felt like an intruder in a museum, careful not to touch anything so as not to disrupt the silent order of the house. But Ezren was her compass. The boy, now that she was close by, began to transform in a way that astonished everyone. Silence gave way to curious questions, apathy to a childlike energy that sought play and discovery. He followed her around the house, showing her his drawings, explaining his imaginary inventions. And Lyra, with her patience and genuine interest, validated every small gesture, every new word, building with him a castle of trust and affection. Kael watched their relationship blossom with a mix of feelings that confused him. There was immense gratitude for seeing his son happy and developing. There was admiration for the way Lyra, with her simplicity and emotional intelligence, achieved what no therapist had been able to. And there was a twinge of jealousy, not for his son, but for the ease with which Lyra accessed Ezren's heart, a territory that for him, the father, was almost always impenetrable. This observation forced him to leave his ivory tower, to spend more time with them, to try to learn that language of affection that he had forgotten, or perhaps never knew how to speak. The evenings at Morley Manor became a ritual. After Ezren fell asleep, exhausted from a day of games and conversation, Lyra and Kael would meet in the vast library. What had begun as meetings to discuss Ezren's progress and strategy for dealing with the press gradually turned into deep, personal conversations. Lyra, with her disarming frankness, questioned him about his work, his beliefs, his loneliness, and Kael, surprising himself, began to open up. He spoke of the pressure of inheriting his father's empire, of the pain of losing Lyra, of his constant fear of failing as a father to Ezren. For the first time in years, Kael Morley was simply Kael, a man with his own pain and his own vulnerabilities. And Lyra, listening to his confidences, began to see beyond the cold billionaire. She saw a man broken by grief, paralyzed by fear, who wore the armor of power to protect himself from further suffering, and she felt a compassion for him that frightened her. That empathy, which had previously been directed only at Ezren, began to extend to the boy's father. She found herself wanting to care for him, wanting to show him that affection was not a weakness, but a strength. And this emotional closeness, born in the midst of a farce, began to transform into something dangerously real. A subtle but undeniable attraction began to grow between them, manifesting itself in longer looks, in more genuine smiles, in a silent tension that filled the air of the library. While the fragile and unlikely family was forming inside the Morley mansion, the outside world, led by Jorna Dravet, was preparing its attack. Jorna, Kael's ex-fiancée, was a woman who did not accept defeat. The humiliation of having been passed over for a stranger from the outskirts fueled her desire for revenge. Using her family's vast network of contacts and media outlets, she began a thorough investigation into Lyra Nellis's life, determined to find any dirt, any secret that she could use to expose and destroy her publicly. It was not long before her private detectives brought her the full story, her humble origins, her sick sister waiting for a transplant, the borrowed invitation to the ball. Jorna had the perfect narrative in hand to paint Lyra as a desperate con artist. The smear campaign was launched with calculated brutality. The headlines in the tabloids and gossip portals were venomous. The Cinderella hoax. Get to know the true story of billionaire Kael Morley's wife. Disease scam. Woman uses sick sister to seduce lonely tycoon. The articles were filled with half-truths, quotes from anonymous sources that questioned Lyra's character, and photos that showed her in her humble neighborhood, at her old job, in contrast to the luxurious images of the ball. Jorna manipulated the narrative masterfully, transforming Lyra's story of despair into a sordid plot by an unscrupulous social climber. Public opinion, always thirsty for a scandal, began to devour the story, and Lyra's image was systematically destroyed. The impact of the media campaign on Lyra was devastating. She, who had always valued her privacy and dignity, found herself exposed, judged, and condemned by millions of people who did not know her. Hateful messages flooded social media, and even her family in Verro Plains began to suffer from harassment from the local press. Guilt consumed her. She felt like she had dragged everyone. She loved into the center of this hurricane of evil. Kael tried to protect her, calling on his lawyers to sue the media outlets for slander and defamation, but Jorna's fake news machine was powerful and relentless. Lyra saw the stress on Kael's face, the way the situation was distracting him from his work and his care for Ezren, and she felt like a burden, a miscalculation in this man's life. The pressure became unbearable when a sensationalist article exposed Niall's health condition in a detail, using her sister's illness as proof of Lyra's self-interested motivation. That was the last straw. Lyra could not allow her sister's struggle, her most sacred pain, to be used as a weapon in this dirty game. At that moment, she decided that she had to leave the Morleys' lives. Her presence there, instead of helping, was only causing more pain, more scandal, more suffering. Protecting Kael and Ezren and preserving Niall's dignity meant disappearing. The decision broke her heart into 1,000 pieces, for she would have to abandon the boy she had learned to love like a son, and the man who, dangerously, had begun to nestle in her heart. One dark night, as the fine, persistent rain fell over Aurellia, mirroring the sadness in her soul, Lyra made arrangements for her escape. She wrote a letter to Kael, a painful letter in which she tried to explain her reasons, asking for forgiveness for all the chaos she had caused, and thanking him for the opportunity to have met him and Ezren. She made it clear that their love for her was a gift she would never forget, but that she could no longer be the cause of so much pain and so many attacks. For Ezren, she left one of her favorite adventure books, Treasure Island, with an encrypted dedication that only he would understand. To my little navigator, sometimes the real treasure is knowing when to come home. I love you, forever, your Lyra. And with a bleeding heart, she left the mansion, taking a taxi towards the darkness and familiarity of Verro Plains. The next morning at Morley Manor was deathly quiet. Kael felt his world fall apart when he found Lyra's letter on his desk. Her words, full of a nobility and self-sacrifice that tore him apart, were both a testament to his character and a sentence of his own loneliness. He had read the letter over and over, anger at Yorna and guilt at his own helplessness consuming him. And then came the discovery that terrified him. Ezren had disappeared too. Panic seized Kael. In a way he had never felt before. His son, his fragile, precious son, was gone. He immediately called his entire security team, but a fatherly instinct, a new intuition that Lyra had helped awaken in him, told him where the boy had gone. Ezren Morley, with the quiet determination that characterized him, had executed his own plan. He had woken up in the early hours of the morning, feeling Lyra's absence in the house like a physical pain. When he found the book and the dedication on his bed, he understood Lyra had returned to her home, and he needed to go get her. Taking advantage of the morning's confusion and the distraction of the servants, the 5-year-old boy, with a backpack containing only his asthma inhaler, some colored pencils, and a sheet of paper, left the mansion. He remembered Lyra's conversations about the train, about the market, about Verro Plains, and guided by an affectionate memory and an unshakable love, he began his journey, a childish odyssey through the big city in search of the woman who had become his mother. Ezren's journey was a series of small miracles and the kindness of strangers. He managed to get on the train, and a ticket collector, seeing him alone instead of throwing him out, took pity on his made-up story about going to find his grandmother and let him continue on his journey. In Verro Plains, an environment that would have been frightening to any other child in his world, Ezren walked with a purpose. He showed people the drawing of Lyra's face, asking if they knew her. And unlike Aurelia's indifference, there he found help. A lady pointed him in the direction of the market. A street vendor gave him a piece of cardboard so he could draw better. And it was on this cardboard that Ezren drew his plea, a heart and the phrase, "Come home." Lyra, holed up in her apartment, was alerted by a breathless neighbor about the lost rich boy who was looking for her near the market. Her heart stopped. She ran out into the street like a madwoman, fear and hope mixing in her chest. And then she saw him, Ezren, small and vulnerable, but with an expression of unshakable determination, holding the improvised sign. The reunion was an explosion of tears and hugs, there, on the simple sidewalk of Verro Plains, under the curious and moved eyes of the neighborhood residents. It was at that moment that Kael's car, guided by his instinct and by the information that his security team was beginning to receive, stopped abruptly next to them. The rain, which had been threatening since early, began to fall, as if the sky was also crying with emotion. Kael got out of the car, the rain mixing with the tears he could no longer hold back. Seeing Ezren, safe and sound in Lyra's arms, was the most painful and, at the same time, most beautiful image he had ever seen. He approached, his body shaking, not from the cold, but from a raw emotion that stripped him of all his defenses. There, under the storm, the powerful billionaire no longer existed. There was only a man, a father, a lover, broken by the fear of loss and the hope of reunion. And it was in this state of complete vulnerability that he finally opened his heart to Lyra, without subterfuge, without strategies, just with the naked truth of his feelings. "Lyra," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I love you. I know I'm a failure at showing it. I know my world is complicated and dangerous, and I know I failed to protect you. But the truth is, my life before you was a desert. You and Ezren brought the rain, and I don't want to go back to the drought." He looked at his son, then back at her. "You weren't on any list, Lyra. You were never part of any plan. You were the most beautiful, life-changing event in my life, and I want you to stay, not because Ezren needs you, but because I need you. We need you. Please come home. Be our home." The confession, spoken so sincerely in the midst of the storm, washed away the last doubts and hurts in Lyra's heart. Lyra's answer came not in words, but in a gesture. She, still holding Ezren, extended her free hand to Kael, inviting him to join her in that embrace. And he did. And there, the three of them, wet from the rain, in the middle of a street in a forgotten suburb, formed the circle of an unlikely but undeniably real family. The residents of Verro Plains, who watched the scene from their windows, witnessed not the scandal that the newspapers tried to sell, but the simple and powerful truth of a story of love and reunion. That night, Kael, Lyra, and Ezren returned to the Morley mansion, no longer as pieces of a farce, but as members of a family that had finally chosen each other. In the months that followed, the new Morley family's life found its own serene rhythm. Kael, with a new perspective on what really mattered, used her influence not only to silence Jorna Dravet's lies, but to expose the unethical practices of her media outlets, sparking a national debate about media accountability. Jorna, discredited and isolated, eventually lost her position on the Morley Tech board and her social relevance, her vendetta turning against her. Kael and Lyra, meanwhile, chose a more low-key life away from the spotlight, focused on building their relationship and caring for Ezren. One of Kael's first and most important actions was the creation of the Lyra Morley Foundation, named after his late wife. The foundation, which was well-funded, had as its main goal to pay for highly complex medical treatments for patients in the public health system, and the first beneficiary, as a symbol of the beginning of a new era, was Lyra Nellis. With the support of the foundation, Lyra finally received the kidney transplant she needed, a successful surgery that restored her health and hope for the future. Her recovery was closely monitored by Lyra, who could now care for her sister without the burden of guilt and financial despair. Kael and Lyra's wedding was an intimate affair, held in the gardens of Morley Mansion, attended only by Lyra, now recovered, Mrs. Gable, Mrs. Davis, and a few true friends. Ezren, beaming in his little suit, was the proud ring-bearer, his smile the most important blessing to their union. There was no press, no influential guests. There was only a celebration of a love that had been tested by prejudice, lies, and distance, and had emerged stronger and truer. It was a celebration of a family built not on convention, but on the solid foundation of gratitude, respect, and a soul connection. Lyra, however, knew that her journey would not be complete if she did not transform her own experience of invisibility into an instrument of change for others. With Kael's full support, she founded her own organization, the Whitelist Foundation. The name, a direct and powerful reference to her experience at the ball, symbolized her mission to create opportunities for talented young people from peripheral communities, ensuring that their Names were included in the lists from which they had previously been systematically excluded: universities, companies, cultural projects. The foundation became Lyra's passion, her life's purpose. The Whitelist Foundation became a resounding success, not only because of the practical results it achieved, but because of its philosophy that talent has no zip code. Lyra, with her pragmatic intelligence and deep empathy, created mentorship programs, scholarships, and partnerships with companies in the Morley Tech Group and beyond, opening doors that once seemed insurmountable for young people in Verro Plains and other communities like it. She became a respected leader, not because she was Kael Morley's wife, but because of her vision, her capacity for work, and her refusal to accept the status quo of social inequality. She was proof that a voice that was once silenced could become a megaphone for many others. Kael Morley, along with Lyra, also reinvented himself as a leader and as a man. Inspired by his wife's work and his own personal transformation, he implemented a more humane and socially responsible corporate culture at Morley Tech, with inclusion and talent development programs for underprivileged communities. He understood that the true strength of his company was not only in its cutting-edge algorithms, but in the people who made it up, in their diversity and their potential. The robot billionaire had given way to a visionary and compassionate leader who understood that the greatest success of an empire is the good it generates for the society around it. Ezren grew up in this environment of love, security, and purpose. Lyra's constant presence, his father's new lightheartedness, and the coexistence with the children and young people from the Whitelist Foundation, who frequently visited the mansion, transformed him into a sociable, communicative, and incredibly empathetic boy. His asthma attacks became increasingly rare, as if the health of his soul was reflected in that of his body, and he continued to draw no longer the face of an anonymous savior, but the smiling faces of his family, his friends, of a world that, thanks to the courage of his heartfelt mother, had become a much more welcoming and colorful place for him. The city of Aurellia, once a symbol of division and exclusivity, slowly began to feel the impact of these transformations. The bridge between the elegant center and the outskirts of Verro Plains, once merely physical, began to become a social and cultural one as well, with the projects of the Whitelist Foundation promoting exchange and mutual recognition that had previously seemed impossible. The story of Lyra and Kael, which had begun as a scandal, had become a local legend, an example that social barriers can indeed be broken down, and that love and empathy are the most powerful tools for this construction. Years later, during the graduation ceremony for the first class of Whitelist Foundation scholarship recipients, Lyra took the stage to present their diplomas. Beside her were Kael and a preteen Ezren, both looking at her with overflowing pride. In her speech, Lyra spoke not of her own achievements, but of the courage of each of those young people who dared to dream and fought to have their names included on the list. "Today," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "this list is no longer blank. It is filled with the names of future doctors, engineers, artists, leaders, and our mission is to ensure that this list never ends, that there is always room for one more name, one more dream, one more story of overcoming." Kael, now fully recovered and serving as the Foundation's outreach director, watched from the audience, tears of joy streaming down her face. Life had given her a second chance, and she was dedicating her time to helping others have the same opportunity. Her sister's journey, which had begun with a desperate act to save her, had turned into a movement of hope that saved hundreds of other lives. It was a cycle of gratitude and redemption that fed back into itself, proving that a single act of love can generate ripples of transformation that reach distant and unexpected shores. Morley Manor, once a castle of isolation, was now a vibrant home and a gathering place for dreamers. Kael found happiness not in the cold perfection his father had taught him to seek, but in the beauty of imperfection, in the warmth of human connection, in the organized mess of family life. He learned that vulnerability was not a weakness, but the gateway to the deepest, truest connections. And his love for Lyra, a love born of chaos and lies, became the most solid and unshakable truth of his existence. Lyra Nellis Morley never forgot where she came from. She returned to Verro Plains often, not as the billionaire's wife, but as Lyra herself, to talk to her old neighbors, to support local businesses, to ensure that her foundation's projects were truly making a difference in the lives of the community. She was the living bridge between the two worlds, proof that it was possible to belong to both without losing your essence, your integrity, and your sense of justice. Her story was a constant reminder that the power to transform society lies not only in grand, philanthropic gestures, but also in the ability to listen, to understand, and to fight alongside those who are systematically ignored. And Ezren, the boy who changed the course of so many lives with a hug and a drawing, grew up to become a young man of remarkable empathy and creativity. He specialized in creating assistive technologies, using his talent for design and his unique understanding of the needs of people with physical or emotional limitations to develop tools that promoted inclusion and autonomy. His own journey, from a boy silenced by illness and isolation to an innovative and engaged young man, was the greatest testament to the success of his family's unplanned method. Love, patience, and an unwavering belief in the potential of each individual. On a sunny afternoon, Kael, Lyra, and Ezren sat in the same park where, years before, Ezren's life had been saved by a stranger. They watched the children playing, the life pulsing around them. "You know," Kael said, holding Lyra's hand, "I think that in the end, the three of us were saved that day." Lyra smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think so. Sometimes we just need someone to really see us so we can start to heal." And Ezren, now a young man who spoke with the confidence of someone who had found his voice, added, "And sometimes a hug can be the beginning of the most beautiful story of all." And they sat there in silence, the three of them, the embodiment of an unlikely but deeply happy family, a family that had learned that true love is the only name that is never left off any list. The press, which had once been Lyra's tormentor, over time began to portray her as an icon of resilience and empowerment. Yorna Dravet's story became a case study in journalism schools about the dangers of media manipulation and lack of ethics. The collapse of her credibility was a bitter reminder that the truth, no matter how much it is attacked and distorted, has a strength of its own that eventually finds its way to the light. The narrative she tried to impose, that of the swindler from the outskirts, was completely supplanted by the real story, that of the strong woman who faced prejudice and used her experience to create opportunities for others. Justice, in that case, did not come from the courts, but from the force of public opinion, which, once confronted with the truth, knew how to recognize the heroine and the villain of that plot. The Lyra Morley Foundation and the White List Foundation, though focused on different issues, often worked together to create an ecosystem of support that ranged from basic healthcare to access to higher education and employment. Kael and Lyra became one of the most influential and respected philanthropic couples in the country, known not for giving money, but for getting personally involved in each project, getting their hands dirty and listening to the real needs of the communities they served. They proved that effective philanthropy is not about charity, but about empowerment, about giving people the tools to build their own futures, so they can write their names on the lists that really matter. Kael, now fully healthy, found in her work at the foundation a new passion and a new meaning for the life she had almost lost. Her own experience as a patient in the public health system made her an invaluable advisor, able to understand the anguish and difficulties of families seeking help. The relationship with her sister, Lyra, which had always been the pillar of her existence, deepened even further, now in a partnership of work and purpose. Together, they were a force of nature, combining Niall's empathy with Lyra's pragmatism to create a lasting and meaningful impact on the lives of hundreds of people. Their gratitude for each other and for the turn of events that fate had brought them was the driving force behind their daily actions. The city of Aurellia, with its stunning beauty and once rigid social barriers, continued its slow transformation. The symbolic bridge between the city centre and the outskirts, built by the work of the foundations and the story of Kael and Lyra, became increasingly solid. Young people from Verro Plains began to attend elite universities, to get jobs at major Aurellia corporations, to feel part of a city that had previously treated them as invisible. The change was not quick or easy, and prejudice did not disappear overnight, but a seed of change had been planted, and its fruits were beginning to be harvested, making the city a place not only more just, but also richer in its diversity and humanity. Kael Morley, the man who once feared affection like a disease, learned to love without reservation. His love for Lyra and Ezren healed him of his own wounds, freed him from the shadow of his overbearing father, and allowed him to become the man his late wife, Lyra, had always known he could be. He honored her memory not with silent, paralyzing grief, but with actions that reflected her generosity and vibrant spirit. And he found in Lyra a life partner who not only loved him, but challenged him, pushed him, and made him a better version of himself every day. The happiness he found was far deeper and more real than any success he had ever achieved in the business world. Lyra Nellis Morley, the unlikely heroine of that saga, never lost her essence. Even though she frequented the most influential circles in the world, she kept her feet firmly planted in the reality from which she came. Her voice, once silenced by invisibility, now echoed in boardrooms, on conference stages, in corridors of power, always defending the same principles: social justice, equal opportunities, and an unshakable belief in human potential. She became living proof that a person's origins do not define their destiny, and that the power to change the world often resides in those whom the world itself tried in vain to erase. And Ezren, the boy who started a silent revolution with a hug, grew up to become a young man of admirable sensitivity and intelligence. His asthma was under control. His silence was replaced by a calm and thoughtful voice, capable of expressing complex ideas and deep feelings. His drawings, which had once been a refuge, became a powerful form of art, of communication, of storytelling. He was the most beautiful fruit of that unlikely union, the symbol that healing, both physical and emotional, often begins with a simple gesture of connection, with the recognition that deep down, all of us, rich or poor, strong or fragile, just want to be seen and loved for who we truly are. Morley Mansion, once a palace of solitude, became a home where the dogur was always open. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had invited Lyra, was an honored guest at every family dinner, always remembered as the accidental fairy godmother of the story. Friends from Verro Plains and Aurelia's business associates mingled in the gardens of the estate, a social mosaic that would have been unthinkable before. The house became a microcosm of the city that Kael and Lyra dreamed of building, a city without lists, without barriers, where a person's worth was measured by their character, not their last name or their address. Their story, in the end, was not just about an unlikely romance or overcoming social barriers. It was about building a family from broken pieces, building bridges over chasms of prejudice. building a better future on the foundations of empathy and justice, and building oneself, a painful but liberating process that Kael and Lyra faced together, proving that the strongest people are not those who never fall, but those who have the courage to get up, to reinvent themselves, and to help others do the same. And so life in Aurellia went on, but something in its soul had changed forever. The story of the invisible list became part of the town's lore, a reminder that the true elite are not those of money or power, but of compassion and courage. And that sometimes a single name, one that doesn't appear on any guest list, can be the one that has the power to open every door, heal every wound, and rewrite every rule of the game. The story of Lyra, Kael, and Ezren was proof that love, gratitude, and justice are, in the end, the only invitations that truly matter.